The thing about Ringo is that we came at a point where we realized that, look, we cannot continue in a system that is broken. And when we say the system is broken, it means we don't have an equitable system, we don't have a just system, we still have huge challenges with poverty, inequality. We have a lot of communities that are not happy about how things are going in terms of their progress and their growth. And so we thought, let's look at how do we reimagine how these INGOs work with national and local organizations.
You know, the project that I really am excited to talk to you about today is your work with RINGO, Reimagining the International NGOs. I think that there's some really intriguing and exciting discussions to have around the changes that are happening in that space. But before we jump into that, Charles, could you give us a little bit of your background, your history, and how you've come to this point?
Yeah. So actually, interestingly, academically, I actually studied banking and finance for my undergrad, but I decided to take a different path because I wanted to work, with communities, and so I thought that the path towards doing something around development for my graduate studies would help me in terms of my future and where I saw myself. And I think the reason is, I grew up in four different African countries, and all those African countries had, gone through colonialism, and I saw the effects of that. But I also saw countries that were struggling to reach their full potential. Some doing better than others in different respects. But it taught me a lot about, yes, the peculiarities of those countries, but also the similarities of the countries on this continent. So, yes, that experience actually made me what we may call Pan African or have a certain African orientation. And so that's what I bring to the work that I do in terms of my principles and my values. So that's who I am, basically. And the vehicle I've chosen to work with is in the civil society space. I find the work that I do challenging, but at the same time rewarding and empowering. And when I say rewarding, it's not in terms of maybe like money or whatever you may think it is, but it's more in terms of the ability and to help and serve. But also, I meet all sorts of incredible people that are doing great work in different communities and who are determined to rewrite their histories. There's a lot of good happening on the continent, which is usually swallowed by a lot of negativity. Yeah.
Right. And that leads us up to your work that you're doing at Ringo. But prior to that, you actually spent a lot of time working at WACSI, and I believe a lot of your experience was with this organization. Can you tell us a little bit about your role and your experience there?
Yeah, so I actually still work at WACSI. Interestingly, Ringo is hosted by WACSI, and currently Ringo is a program. A lot of people feel that Ringo is actually an individual organization. No, it's a program, but you never know what the future will bring. So yes, I work at WACSI, and the role I play at WACSI is to lead on the capacity strengthening efforts of the institute. And WACSI is kind of unique because it's a civil society facility that focuses on capacity strengthening of civil society entities, whether they are formal, informal, or movements. And so we are not necessarily thematic driven, which is kind of strange, but we are actually sectorial driven. So we are more ecosystem focused. We are interested in the whole sector of civil society, and which means yes, those who work in the environment, those who work in humanitarian, those who work in social justice and governance, the whole ecosystem of institutions, individuals, partners. That's our concern. So that's the work I do. WACSI. And of course, WACSI being West African means our mandate is within West Africa. We currently cover 15 ECOWAS countries. So ECOWAS is our regional body, the Economic Community of West African States. We have 15, but then we have 18 countries. So is that 15 plus Cameroon, Chad, and Mauritania? So we go a bit into what we call Central Africa. But geographically, those countries are actually West Africa, if you look at it from a geographic perspective. Yeah.
Got it. And that makes sense, being ecosystem focused. And when you say ecosystem, you're talking about the organizational structures, not habitat ecosystem, aren't you?
Yes,
That makes
organizational
sense,
structure.
right? And that makes sense that you then launched. There was the Ringo program came out of this because you've been looking at the ecosystems and looking at some of the challenges, and so therefore Ringo came out of that analysis, didn't it? And so,
Yes,
can you
absolutely.
talk to us a little bit about what is Ringo, and what is the problem that you're trying to address with Ringo?
Yes, so the thing about Ringo is that we came at a point where we realized that, look, we cannot continue in a system that is broken. And when we say the system is broken, it means we don't have an equitable system, we don't have a just system. We still have huge challenges with poverty, inequality. We have a lot of communities that are not happy about how things are going in terms of their progress and their growth, especially within the global south, for lack of a better phrase. And so the international aid architecture needed a look in. And of course, this is something that is not new. People have been discussing and have had many prescriptions about how this aid architecture could actually be mended. But we thought that we would do something a bit different. And how different? We thought that we will look at the whole global architecture, but use the INGOs as the pivot. And the reason we wanted to use the INGOs as a pivot was because INGOs are everywhere within the global south. They have huge influence, huge infrastructure, and they've been working in the global south for many, many years. So they are the most influential entity when it comes to global north organizations within the aid architecture. And so we thought, let's look at how do we reimagine how these INGOs work with national and local organizations. How can we reimagine how they fund organizations? How can we reimagine how they build partnerships and collaborations? How can we reimagine how they do risk and compliance? So, all the aspects of the aid architecture, the value chain, how do we reimagine that so that it becomes more equitable, more just, more empowering? And the reason this happened was it was at a time when there was a lot of calls for shifting power. Where did that come from? It came from the movements, Black Lives Matter, right? All the other movements that were happening, where there was a spotlight on the issues of the impact of structural racism, colonialism on the whole aid architecture, right? And so we thought that was a great opportunity for us to start this initiative, try and get some people into a systems change process to think through how this system can be improved. And so initially, we got 55 people into a lab, and these 55 people came mostly from INGOs, but there were academics, there were also national and local organizations, representatives in there to really think through why are we experiencing some of these difficult challenges? What are the areas of stuckness? Why is it that we're not able to overcome some of these development challenges that we have? So we went through that process, and there was a process of identifying some of these challenges around accountability, impact and measurement, around solidarity and partnerships, risk sharing, resource flows. I mean, there were so many issues in systemic inequalities, etc. So we identified some of these challenges, went through a whole process of defending and proposing how some of these things can be overcome. And then we even went further to get people to develop what we call prototypes. So, as part of the Ringo process, we have these innovations or prototypes. And one of those prototypes I think that you saw was the Decolonizing Advisory Community. Right. So this prototype is currently hosted by WACSI. And for example, this specific prototype is looking at how do we put in the front burner the issues of decolonizing? How do we help funders, institutional funders, INGOs, decolonize their policies and practice? What does that mean? It means for them to take a look at how they work, the ways they work, and how the colonial thinking and colonial practices have been embedded in their practices and policies over the years. First of all, you have to identify this thinking. You have to identify these practices, and then for you to propose alternatives. And so that's what decolonizing is about. And the good thing was that while we were looking at this, organizations already started thinking about this. There are many INGOs that were going through their own internal processes. Some of them were networks, some were coalitions. They've been thinking through some of these issues, but they never had a place where they could go, where they can tap into a resource that could help them go through this process. And so, one of the features of the Decolonizer Advisory Community is a matchmaking service where the service providers will be linked to the service users. Service users being INGOs and institutional funders. But apart from that matchmaking service, it's also the broader objective is to build a community of all of us, whether we are in the global south or the global north, for us to learn about decolonization. How can we do this practically? How can we do this in terms of in our own institutions? Who needs to be involved? How do we influence the changes at that level? And also, how do we then influence the changes in the broader system? And so we went through all that. And now we are at the phase where we realize that, look, for us to make significant inroads, there are two key stakeholders that we need to have a much more robust engagement with. The first is institutional funders, so the private foundations, and then also the bilaterals. So bilaterals like FCDO, USAID, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands, yes. So we've created what we call action ports. So we have what we call the funder action port. Then we also recognize that we need to engage at the decision making level or the leadership level with INGOs. And so now we also have a board action port or an INGO board action port where we have a collective. I think we are about 22 members or trustees from some of the biggest INGOs in the world and some of the most influential. They may not be so big, but quite influential on that board action port. So we have these two pods now meeting. So it's like a basically like a community of practice, right? And so conversations then are going on about specific issues. One of the issues that we tackled in the board action pod was how do we respond to issues around structural racism? And these are some of the very deep, uncomfortable conversations that we're having as a board action pod. And how, as a board member, do you champion decolonization on the board? Especially when there's orientation on many boards that you have to focus on compliance, on growth, and then resourcing. So, how do you champion transformation or transformative ways of working as a board member? So those are the conversations that we are having. And then with the funder action pod, we decided that look, we will leverage on an existing platform. The Council of Foundations from the US, which is made up of some of the biggest private foundations in the US, they have their own platform. And so we partnered with them to have conversations on how funders can work better with organizations that they fund, who they should be funding, how they should be funding. So the issue of flexible funding, how organizations like WACSI, who they call intermediaries or anchor. I prefer anchor organizations. How they can leverage on anchor organizations to get funding to some of the most important communities or community members who may not fit into that typical criteria that they have, but are doing amazing work in very difficult places around the world. So we are having all these conversations. And the question you probably answer you'll be asking is this going to change anything? Where is the change happening? Well, I'll say something to you. Just recently, the Swedes, CEDA, they came out with something quite groundbreaking. They've now saying that with their funding now, it's not only going to be available to be accessed by NGOs in Sweden, but they are opening it up for NGOs in the global south to apply directly for the funding. And uh, this is their new policy that they've just come out with. And so the changes are happening. I know there are a lot of changes happening within INGOs themselves. There are a lot of changes happening in other places. So, for example, recently FCDO approached us. FCDO is like the USAID, UK version of the USAID. They approached us and said, look, we want you to help us get the views of civil society to shape our programming for the future, to shape our support for civic space issues in the global south. And so we partnered with Bond, which is the UK umbrella organizations of civil society organizations, and then did an engagement where we had both virtual and in-person engagements with constituencies from sub-Saharan Africa, from Middle East and North Africa, from Central Asia, from Eastern Europe, and even from within the United Kingdom, in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And the report is about to be released. Well, the executive summary of the report is about to yeah, and it was very, very insightful in terms of the kind of inputs that were made by. So for me, these are changes that are happening, which is for me is quite significant. And interestingly, that process, WACSI led it. So for an organization that's based in the global south to lead a process like this was even very new and very different, and I think extremely empowering. So this is the reason why we are really pushing this agenda. And the thing is, why are we doing this? We're doing this basically because we want to make sure that by the time we get to 2030, right, the ecosystem that we find ourselves will be more nurturing, more empowering, more equitable. We'll have communities that make decisions for themselves, right? The process of delivering aid will be more participatory. Aid will become not just a foreign policy kind of tool, but really a social justice kind of tool. We want aid to mean something. And we also want people to recognize that in this part of the world, we also have assets, we also have knowledge. And it's not just a kind of one directional relationship, but we want a multi-directional kind of relationship where we can also share what we have and what we are doing. Just like we get information from the global north. So this is what we are working to. We are hoping that so from some years to come, we don't even have to use the words global north or global south. We can just talk about global civil society, and there's respect and a certain equity about the way we do things.
So this is it's very exciting, and this is exactly why I wanted to have a conversation with you. Um, Let me ask you a question. Again, I come from the private sector, so it's there's a lot that happens in this sector which is new for me to understand. And so, if I was to try to understand what I believe is happening, is there is traditionally there's been financial support that's come from the global north, and that's been very far away from the people on the ground who it's affecting, and that distance has been a problem because there's been trust issues, and there's been limitations and restrictions put on the funding to ensure that it goes to a certain use. But the problem with that is those restrictions are set thousands of miles away from the problem, and so there's
Absolutely.
an inefficiency. And
Absolutely.
so part of the idea of decolonization, and I'm sure it's more nuanced and refined than I'm explaining, but my basic understanding is that it's about moving the decision making back to the organization, the local organizations, the local communities, so that they can be making the decisions about how the resources are deployed to move things forward. Was that characterization an accurate reflection of?
No, Anton, you're spot on. You're spot on. You're spot on. Before the decisions were made, the framework was decided, the strategy was decided, priorities were decided, and we just felt like we're subcontractors, implementation machines. Right now, what we are saying is, look, I know this is a buzzword, but we want to be part of the co-design process. We want to participate in the conceptual thinking behind a specific program, or we want our views and perspectives reflected in that conceptual thinking about how that specific program should work. Because we work in the communities, we understand these communities, we know what their priorities are. But don't go in there with a deficit mentality. That's another thing. Go in there with an asset mentality, recognizing that you are a co-investor, right? So the community itself has its own assets, has its own networks, has its strengths, and you are then co-investing with them to fulfill a specific objective. So this whole idea, we're trying to turn on its head this whole idea of charity, right? And we are saying that the old school or traditional way of thinking about charity does not lead to proper transformative outcomes. We need to think of charity as an investment, and to recognize that those who come in to support must see themselves as co-investors because they are also interested in the ultimate objective. But recognizing that those who are in the communities have their investments that they've made. It may not be money, but it could be other things like expertise, like their networks, their local knowledge, right? And all these things must be quantified, right? Are things that should be recognized. And yes, so Anton, you're absolutely right.
So I then start to wonder what, therefore, is the role and the future role of the INGOs,
Fantastic.
and how are they how do they respond to this kind of initiative?
Yeah, I think that I can understand the anxiety and sometimes even the fear because if you've been doing something for a long time, that is what you know. But I see this as an opportunity for INGOs actually to reimagine themselves. What do I mean? I think that INGO should move away from thinking about being implementers, but look at a more empowering role of being enablers, more empowering role of being facilitators, more empowering role of being brokers, more empowering role of being able to support in terms of capacity strengthening and then documentation, right? Or evidence building, technical advice. I find those roles more empowering because they have built over the years infrastructure, knowledge, and expertise that will enable them to play these roles in proposing even much better than the implementation role. It is very difficult to implement in a way that will lead to a transformational outcome when you don't understand the context or when you don't appreciate or have a relationship with the communities, especially because you come in there and then you create and design programs that are very much transactional. And so what you do is you have a transactional outcome. So you did a project there, funds ran out, you left. The community does not own that project. When you speak to the community, they tell you that, oh, you mean this INGO's project? Well, the funds ran out, they left, right? We can't have that into the future. I think we need to learn our lessons. So for me, I see this as an opportunity for INGOs to position themselves differently and even to position themselves to be more relevant in the long term. If they don't do this, unfortunately, the tide of change is coming. A lot of INGOs may become irrelevant. I mean, the way I see it, when I look at it and I look at how things are going on, and you've noticed that they've started pressing the panic buttons. Many INGOs have decided to come into our space and register as national organizations. I think that's a panic move. Yes, now they've started to compete with our organizations for the same resources. And that has now created some sort of enmity, distrust, and even deep challenges. Yes. So I feel that that localization agenda of INGO was not well thought through. I think they should have stepped back to think about how we can play more enabling roles and reduce our implementation kind of ways of working. So for me, that would be the advice for INGOs. So when I meet colleagues from INGOs, I say, don't be anxious, don't there's no need to fear. Change is always, it can be messy, but ultimately this will make your organizations even more relevant and will be seen as genuine partners. Now, I'm not sure whether the kind of relationship we have is actually genuine. The truth be told, the current form, the relationship we have is a funding relationship, and it hardly goes beyond that in its current form. But I believe if they transform, right, we will have a much more genuine relationship that goes way beyond funding.
No, I can see that. I recently met and did a conversation with Fred Nelson of Malia Silly, and they have a very much a enabler model, and I think they could be a very good example of that kind of model going forward. Charles, I want to wrap it up because you've been very generous with your time, and I'm aware you have
Thank
to get
you.
away. So thank you very much for joining me on the light side of green. If people want to get in touch with you, how can they find you and your work?
Yes, so I'm on LinkedIn, Charles Kojo
Right.
Vandyck. I'm sure you'll have it when you
I'll put
post
it
it.
in the links. Yeah.
Or you can get in touch with me. Alternative Convos. My podcast is on Spotify, on Google, on Apple, and some other platforms. But then
Right.
again, the Ringo project has its own LinkedIn page now. We just
Okay.
we just started one. And when you type in Ringo project, we have a website which we are transitioning. We were first hosted by Rights Collab. Now that WACSI
Right.
is hosting it, we're transitioning to its own website right now. And then you can also visit WACSI, West Africa Civil Society Institute. We are all
Okay.
on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn. Yeah, so you catch up with the
Okay.
work we're doing. Yeah, thanks, Anton.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Charles.
Thank you. Thank you. Cheers.